unabashed,
the most unpredictable,
becomes a headline,
the most volatile,
outrageous behavior,
unsubstantiated narratives, a battle of personalities.
Welcome to Grant Tamasha, a co-production of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and the Hindustan Times. I'm your host, Milan Vaishnav. There are two narratives doing the rounds about Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi's recent visit to Washington to break bread with U.S. President Donald Trump. The first narrative, touted by the government and its backers, is that Modi skillfully threaded the needle with Trump, standing up for Indian interests, but also giving the president some important early wins that can position India well for the future. The second narrative suggests a more pessimistic vision, that U.S.-India relations are at a precarious juncture where a volatile and transactional president just might upend bilateral ties at a time when India can scarcely afford it. To discuss where U.S.-India ties sit in the aftermath of the Modi visit, I'm joined on the show today by Rajesh Rajagopalan. Rajesh is professor of international relations at Jawaharlal Nehru University in New Delhi. He's an expert on nuclear affairs, Indian foreign policy, and U.S.-India relations. He's also the author of a brand new article published in ThePrint titled India-U.S. Ties Stuck in Cute Acronyms, Delhi Must Wait Out the Chaos. To talk more about the U.S. and India and to discuss his recent article, I'm pleased to welcome Rajesh to the show for the very first time. Rajesh, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you, Milan. Thank you so much for inviting me.
I want to start by asking you to go back to a piece that you wrote for ThePrint in November 2024. I think it was just after Donald Trump was reelected as the 47th president. You wrote in November that the world Donald Trump is taking over is even more dangerous than the one he left behind 4 years back. And despite everything that's happened in between, including America's kind of concerted shift towards, engaging, pivoting the Indo-Pacific, the Biden administration's policies have in many cases worsened the situation. I think that's a good place to start. If you could just elaborate for us, in your view, how did the Biden administration's policies make a difficult situation even worse?
Yeah, thank you again, Milan. I think when the basic part of it is that China's power has increased again in the last 4 years or so, and the world has also gotten a lot more complicated because of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and of course, a year before that, year before the elections, the Gaza war beginning. So overall, there had been a number of things that had happened since Trump left that has made the world a lot more dangerous and a lot more unfavorable to the United States and its partners and allies. I mean, the entire Ukraine conflict also served to bring Russia and China closer to each other, even though, of course, there have historically been differences between Russia and China. But nevertheless, because currently they were both facing the U.S. and the West, both see the U.S. and the West as potentially their problems, they have come together. And so what you have is a situation where you have a tightening relationship between China and Russia. You have a conflict, a war that Russia initiated against Ukraine that because the Biden administration was not very forthcoming in terms of its support, or at least it was very slow in various aspects of its support to Ukraine, has essentially led that conflict to being stalemated, more or less. I mean, it hasn't really helped Ukraine to defeat Russia. That might have been difficult, but at least if the Biden administration had been much more forthcoming, it might have led to a better situation in Ukraine, and in which case you could have had, it would have potentially ended, and then you could have had the Biden administration itself focusing more on the Indo-Pacific. So because of the slow response, I mean, if you look at every type of weapon system that the Biden administration was asked to supply to Ukraine, whether it is tanks or artillery and so on and so forth, they took a long time because they were so afraid of escalation, about nuclear escalation. And in each case, when they finally did make that, did eventually supply those, there was no escalation. So, they miscalculated in terms of the of how much escalation there would be. And so, so we ended up in a situation where there is a war that is continuing now, for several years, without any respite, and which is taking away attention from the Indo-Pacific. So that's basically what I meant, that, you had a stalemated conflict because of, to some extent, because of the Biden administration's very slow response, fear of escalation. But you also have a larger situation, which was the fact that China's growing power. It's until, I think, not because of Trump or Biden, but because of China's own calculus and China's own internal developments, you are seeing in the last few years China's wealth being converted into military power. I mean, until very recently, we didn't really worry. The expectation was that, of course, China's getting wealthier, but we didn't really see a huge increase in China's military power. But the last 4-5 years or so, what we have seen is everything from Chinese conventional power being enhanced quite rapidly. New aircraft carriers that we didn't think China would have for another 10, 15, 20 years. 3-4 aircraft carriers being brought online. You have China suddenly building, next generation fighter planes, stealth fighter planes that we didn't expect. We have a sudden and rapid expansion of China's nuclear forces, which again was unexpected. So you have a series of developments in both Indo-Pacific as well as the European theater, plus, of course, now the Gaza war. So that is the context in which I was saying that Trump was taking over a much more dangerous world.
So, Trump was elected on November 5th. You have this traditional gap of, about 2.5 months before Inauguration Day. Shortly after Inauguration Day, Prime Minister Modi comes to visit him, fourth head of state to do so. Heading into last week's Modi-Trump summit in Washington, you noted that there were many early indications that the Trump administration was quite positively disposed towards India. So, before we get into the substance of the summit and what actually happened, what were some of those reasons for optimism, amongst the kind of officialdom in India that India was relatively well placed?
Yeah, I think that to begin with, the inauguration itself, where the Foreign Minister Jaishankar was given a front row seat, which was quite unexpected, and which was, which almost seemed odd. And then,
in a small inauguration, because it was held indoors because of the cold, so it was a rather intimate thing rather than the crowds of tens of thousands of people which you normally get.
Exactly. I mean, it was quite, and to see him right there, I mean, right in the front seat. I mean, so it was, and these things are, of course, very, very carefully choreographed. And so that was very, very deliberate signal. And the fact that Modi was one of the earliest leaders to speak to him, but also was one of the earliest visitors, as you mentioned, it was the fourth foreign visitor to meet with Trump, but also the Quad meeting immediately after the inauguration. All of these seem to suggest that that within the administration that they had a very favorable view of India. I mean, both in Trump. I'm not saying that Trump was not part of that. I mean, I'm sure he was part of that also. There definitely was a sense, if you only until the day of the summit, I think, if you just looked at the signals that were emanating from the administration until that day, I think it was it seemed as if India was one of the 3 or 4 major partners that the U.S. wanted to have over the coming in the Trump administration. So those early signals were unusual. I mean, in the sense that we have never had the Indian Prime Minister being the fourth visitor to any previous U.S. president. We have never had the foreign minister being given that sort of importance. We've never had a quad meeting within a day of the inauguration. So all of that tended to suggest, I think, at least I thought that was, or those are all very good early omens for U.S.-India relations.
So let's come to your column for ThePrint, which was published on February 17th, and we'll link to that in the show notes. You warned in this piece, Rajesh, that U.S.-India relations have plateaued. And when it comes to the actual outcomes following this White House meeting, you write that there is little to suggest any progress on U.S.-India ties. And I guess the question for you is, we had, as is tradition, this very lengthy joint statement in which all sorts of things from defense to energy to technology to science were mentioned. Why did you take away from this that there weren't enough concrete signs of forward progress? What kind of shaped your thinking?
I think a couple of different things. One is the fact that on the trade issue, there were still differences. The second is the fact that if you look at the overall relationship over the last many years, we have had only one major movement that we can think about, the Quad being reestablished in 2017, and then India becoming a lot more receptive to the Quad after 2020, after the Chinese, the confrontation with China in Galvan. So that is, so in a sense, you see that those were major changes in the sense that you had a much closer, you had the relationship improving much more suddenly over a few years. But outside of that, we haven't really seen a lot happening, other than, of course, these very, very elaborate, very long sort of joint statements and communiques. And even if you look at the Quad after that, after 2020, the clear sense amongst almost all the outside experts who are looking at the Quad is that the Quad has not really progressed, because the name of the Quad itself, right? I mean, it was originally the Quad Security Dialogue. We simply call it the Quad now, right? Before 2020, India was unwilling even to call it the Quad. I mean, if you go back and look at all the joint statements from 2017 to 2020, Indian MEA statements would have these very elaborate framing of it as the U.S., India, Japan, Australia group. We never refer to it as a Quad. Even when, for example, in a press conference, somebody would ask a question about the Quad, the response would be the U.S., India, Japan, Australia group, and so on and so forth, not mentioning the Quad. After 2020, and I think primarily as a consequence of the Chinese attack in Galvan, we started calling it the Quad. But then the security part dropped out. And if you look at all of the things that Quad does, it is the security part seems to be increasingly taking a backseat to lots of other things. All those things are important. I'm not saying those things are not important, to vaccines and various other forms of cooperation, including on financing, on infrastructure, health. All of those are important. Cybersecurity, those are all important. But all of those should have been in addition to greater security cooperation within the Quad. And what we have is that in the place of security cooperation, I think, and others have written about this. Others have also pointed to the fact that we need to have more on the security side in the Quad, because it's essentially was meant to be a security dialogue, was meant to, not an alliance definitely, but meant to increase security cooperation between India and the US and Japan and Australia. It was also, I think, something that is often forgotten is the fact that the Quad is essentially designed to bring India into that because, Australia, Japan, and the United States are already security partners. They are all allies. They are defense partners. They don't need the Quad to have security cooperation. And of course, in the last couple of years, Japan and Australia have additional security agreements. Japan and South Korea have additional security agreements. So there is a whole set of security arrangements that are developing in the region outside of Quad, right? I mean, so there's already security treaties between the United States and these countries, and then additional ones that are taking place already. So the Quad's primary purpose was to include India in that. And it appears that India is by its own. I'm not saying that this was other people keeping India out. I think it is essentially India's choice that we are not getting closer to in terms of greater security cooperation. And even on the bilateral ones, yes, we have in U.S. is a country with which India has the largest number of military exercises. That is true. But that has been the case for many years now. And, again, that has not really progressed very far. And there is increasing concern about the fact that this is not leading to anything beyond those kinds of military exercises. For example, I mean, simple thing like if there is a contingency like in Ukraine or like we had in 1999 in Cargill or anything of that kind, if others have to help us, if the United States or Australia or Japan, anybody has to help us with equipment or anything else, what is it that India might possibly require, right? I mean, there has to be prior discussions about what kind of contingencies might arise and what kind of help might be required. Those conversations are not taking place, right? I mean, and exercises by themselves, exercises are better than nothing, but by themselves, they have a declining utility. And so, we already passed that phase. And so we haven't really progressed beyond that. And that's a point that I was making about the fact that it is plateaued. And for a number of years, I've been suggesting that India should be more open to greater security cooperation, but obviously that has not happened. So I'm getting I'm getting more and more pessimistic about the possibility that there will be greater security cooperation.
This is George Perkovich. For 3 decades, the Carnegie Nuclear Policy Conference has helped government officials, journalists, NGOs, industry, scholars, and students to debate and understand the latest risks and possible pathways to managing them. This year's conference will be held on April 21 and 22. Registration is open, but seating is limited. For more information on the program and to register, go to carnegieendowment.org/NPC2025.
Well, I think, one of the things, and this goes to the title of the piece that you pointed out, and others have as well, is that, there was a lot of renaming of things, right? A kind of old wine in new bottles, right? So we went from this ISET initiative on critical and emerging technology. We now have the acronym TRUST, transforming the relationship, utilizing strategic technology. You have this great line in the piece, which made me laugh out loud, where you said, it's unclear if there's a whole division within the Prime Minister's office devoted to generating these acronyms. But if there is, they must be the hardest working unit within the Indian government, right? So I think one of the things you pointed out, and other places too in this piece, is that they sort of have taken these existing initiatives which may have had a Biden administration stamp on them, and repackage them to make them seem as if they were new, but they're essentially just dressed up in different clothing.
Right. Yeah, I mean, this is, of course, these acronyms are something that the Indian government, the current government seems to like for some reason. I mean, we have lots of these different acronyms. And of course, Trump also likes that because best example is NAFTA being renamed as God knows what. I mean, the same agreement basically renamed as something else. I mean, so he also kind of likes this kinds of stuff to sort of claim that he had some victory over or some sort of win in some of these cases, but it is not clear that there is any substantive improvement that is made in these kinds of renaming exercise. I mean, it's not as if there is anything more that is done, but it's also that we are getting lost in the large number of agreements that we have between U.S. and India, but also with other countries, but especially in this particular case, of course, with U.S. and India, that I don't know what the follow-up is and whether there is very much follow-up in terms of they have a 1 or 2 meetings, and then what is a substantive benefit that happens as a consequence of these kinds of initiatives, because we have had these dialogues and initiatives for the last 10, 15 years, and we don't have a whole lot to show for it.
Just to stick on the technology bit for a second, I mean, obviously one of the big developments during the Biden years was ISET, as we just spoke about. But you have been critical of what you see as India's kind of 2-decade-long demand for greater high technology transfers in the United States. Tell us for a moment why you think that push has maybe been inappropriate or perhaps misguided.
We have, let me backtrack a little bit. We have been having various types of international agreements on weapons manufacturing, because I think from the very beginning, from the 1950s, we wanted to be self-sufficient in terms of weapons. And so going back to the 1950s, we built a fairly advanced airframe at that point of time, using German expertise, but nevertheless, we did build it. And then once we built an arms relationship with the Soviet Union, we started building several of their weapons systems, including the MiG-21 that we built hundreds of. And so, so we went from there. The assumption there was that once you start building it, you will develop an arms industry that can take care of India's needs, and you would not need to depend on other countries. Now, that initial effort, whether it is rebranded British tanks as Vijayantha or MiG-21s and things like that, ships, we haven't really developed that, right? I mean, and so after a point of time, I think by the 80s, 90s, 90s and even later, the focus shifted in India from buying whole weapon systems to saying, okay, we need technology, we will develop it otherwise. I mean, other things we will develop. We just need them to give us the technology, because building under license doesn't really give us the technology as such. And we're just, putting things together, assembling stuff rather than really developing, understanding the technology. But that hasn't really helped either, because essentially the Indian defense industry cannot assimilate little bits of technology. I mean, there are very few examples in the Indian defense and technology sector where we take 1 or 2 bits and then develop something out of it. It's partly a structural problem, in the sense that the Indian defense services are not large enough to sustain a purely domestic defense industry. I mean, you need to be able to sell to other countries and so on, if you wanted to have a defense industry that is world class. And until very recently, and I admit that it's true that the current government has liberalized the defense production part of it, and so we do now have private sector players producing artillery and armored vehicles and other kit for the services and selling some of this. But this is, you are not going to be. So the point was that it was a very brief comment, but I mean, the larger thought that I had was that this kind of technology, you are not ever going to be able to assimilate outside of a larger framework where you are developing weapons, and you can't really develop weapons when you are only you're only supplying to the Indian services. It's a larger problem that we face, and so we are beginning to adjust that in the sense that we are now allowing private players to take part in the global market, which is the right way to do, because of course Brazil, to give one example, has a fairly good aircraft industry because they supply to the global market, and they are able to sort of compete successfully with the Boeings and the Airbus and things of that kind. But we need to have started that earlier, and so I'm not sure exactly what kind of technology it is that they are going to get from outside, from the United States, which would do very much for developing the Indian, indigenous defense industry. So there are one or two bits that you could potentially point to. I'll give one or two examples. One of, the U.S. has developed an electromagnetic catapult for its aircraft carriers. The latest aircraft carrier, the U.S. aircraft carrier, has an electromagnetic, as opposed to the old steam catapults. Fair enough. I mean, I think that's the technology that India could use, and I think that was offered to us. I'm not sure exactly what the status of that particular transfer is. India is developing its own. Maybe India will develop its own, or maybe India can cooperate with the United States on developing an electromagnetic launch system. China seems to be doing the same thing in developing that. So that's it's one small bit of technology that goes into an aircraft carrier. So fair enough. You can have that particular thing. But beyond that, it's very difficult to see where these kinds of initiatives go, because and many others have also pointed this out, that exactly how does this work? I mean, you take what technology does the US give, and how does this get incorporated into the Indian R&D or defense R&D process, or Indian defense production process. Those things are not very clear. So there's a lot of discussion going on, but really not very much that comes out of it in terms of any actual product that we can talk about. And of course, this is complicated by the structure of the American defense R&D production and general R&D, which is largely in the private sector, not really in the public sector. So there are all of these complications that I think call into question this sort of model that we seem to have, that somebody else is going to supply us technology and we are going to build weapons and things of that kind with the technology. And of course, with Trump now, that becomes even more problematic.
Well, let's come to Trump, actually, because in the piece, you call him the most self-centered leader in American presidential history, which is most certainly an understatement. And you go on to say that, look, perhaps, the best any country like India can do under these circumstances is to hold on, wait the current crop out, and hope that no crisis strikes in between. Now, if you kind of go back a bit, heading into this administration, there were many officials in MEA, elsewhere in the Indian government, who struck a more confident tone about Trump 2.0, saying, Trump 1.0, it worked out okay for India. There was a lot of collateral damage. India somehow managed to navigate that kind of turbulence relatively well. Coming now to where we are, speaking just a few days after the summit, do you detect that there are higher levels of anxiety inside the kind of corridors of power in Delhi, saying, well, actually, wait, this could be actually a very different kettle of fish now we're dealing with?
I should obviously preface this by saying that I'm not really, as an academic, I don't really have great access into the corridors of power. So I with that caveat in mind, I do, nevertheless, I do detect some concern. I think especially because of some of Trump's rhetoric about trade and
this reciprocal tariff issue,
reciprocity about technology, about all of this, about all of those tariffs, all of those things which are a problem. With Musk, definitely that's another issue that is potentially, I think, is worrying. So yes, I think in the earlier confidence had to do with the fact that, as others have said, there were guardrails in the last administration, that Trump was trying to be respectable and therefore had, at least in the first 3 years, people who were well versed with the system. I mean, so who were regular conservative Washington insiders by and large, and even others who even if they were not Washington insiders, who were normal conservatives and who were not trying to destroy the system to rebuild it or whatever their objective is. I think so. So there was a sense that yes, the last time. So based on that experience from the last administration, I think there was a feeling that yes, we had to be nimble, and I think to give credit to the Indian Foreign Office establishment, they were quite nimble the last time, and they did manage to keep India out of sight, as it were, to the extent possible. And we didn't have a bad time in the last Trump administration. I mean, it didn't really cause too much damage. Partly, I think, partly because of the fact that there were, as I say, others in the room in the White House, but also because there were other issues that were occupying the Trump administration's attention, and we did not get in the middle of it, and so we managed to ride that out. This time, I think, especially after the first few days, I think there is greater concern in the sense that this whole reciprocity business becomes a problem for India because the trade imbalance with the U.S. is quite large, $40-50 billion. It's not like you could correct that, and it's an easy. I mean, in the sense that it's an easy number to see.
Right.
It's very difficult.
It's hard to hide.
It's very difficult to hide it. I mean, so how do you correct for it? I mean, so you could buy oil of other fuel from the United States, I suppose, which is what he seems to want to push. But I don't know how much of that can be covered with petroleum products and things of that kind. I mean, he mentioned F-35s. That doesn't really fit within our plans. I don't know how, but nevertheless, you could buy a couple of squadrons of F-35s and just to sort of,
placate
but
him.
I mean, placate him. It's going to screw up our entire, Air Force plans because we have other plans for the future. And so, including domestic aircraft production, which is suspect, but nevertheless, that's what they're planning to do. So there are all these concerns. And of course, then there is the whole Musk business, because India was favorably disposed towards Musk. We did invite him, have a meeting with even Prime Minister and whatnot, and he didn't turn up.
Well, and then there was a sudden change in India's electric vehicle tariff policy, right? I mean, there was this expectation that there would be announcements about Tesla EV factories coming up, and at the last minute, I think it's been widely reported in the press, Musk decided to double down on China, and I think that left some scars in Delhi.
That is true, but it's also that I think Trump is right to point to the fact that Indian auto industry is heavily protected and whatnot, which is unnecessary at some level, because even if you had low tariffs and if you had equitable tariffs, I don't think American automobile industry is going to succeed overnight. I mean, India is a very difficult market. We have had at least two major American manufacturers in both General Motors and Ford. I mean, General Motors had Chevy and Ford was there. Both of them left because they couldn't compete. I mean, so India is not it's not an easy market. It's a very difficult market for the automobile sector, especially in general, but especially for the automobile sector. And so I don't think we need to fear that much. But anyway, the point is that there is a fear of, of these kinds of pursuit of reciprocity by Trump. And, the first few days, of course, feels like a year after the 20th. I mean, it's very difficult to keep track of everything that Trump says, including, I completely miss out the fact that Trump said something about Taiwan and, So there is a whole set of, it's very difficult to not only keep track of everything that he says, but also that we don't know how much of it is serious, what will exactly placate him, what the new players in DC that do we have any into them? So, so there's a whole set of, I think, concern about all of this that came up after the summit, because it's even it's one thing to sort of mention this elsewhere, but for Trump to come out and say, I told the prime minister this, that is also a little bit not just undiplomatic, but also slightly worrying for, I think, the Indian establishment, that not that he would just say that, but also that he would go out and say that in public, that he mentioned that he talked to the prime minister about it, because it puts the prime minister in a kind of a difficult position. I mean, in the sense that it is as if, so what did you say in response? I mean, you're supposed to be also a strong man. You're in the box. You're supposed to be a strong man also. I mean, you are supposed to be, India supposed to be this great power. This is not the days of Manmohan Singh. From their sort of rhetoric, and so you're supposed to stand up for India and all of that. So, I mean, I think there is concern about the specifics in terms of tariffs and things of that kind, but also about the uncertainty about what Trump might say next or what he might do, and about the unsteadiness of it.
Hey, Grant the Masha listeners. Thanks for listening to the podcast. Putting this show together each week is a labor of love, but it takes a lot of work to put out a great show every week. If you'd like to support the work we do at Grant the Masha, please visit ceip.org/donate. Don't forget to subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or on your favorite podcasting platform, so you'll be the first to know when a new episode rolls out. Yeah, I mean, you say at one point in the piece that, look, the greater problem is not really about the state of U.S. India relations. It's the uncertainty about the United States itself, right? And that, in some sense, is a concern. We've talked about Elon Musk a couple of different times, so maybe now is a natural time to just kind of pause on that for a second. I was struck when I was in Delhi in December, before the inauguration, by the extent to which there were several officials who expressed anxiety, not so much about Trump, but about Elon Musk. And I think if I had to boil it down, there was a suspicion or a fear that, given Musk's own private business interests, that he might use his influence and his proximity to Trump to try and nudge Trump to enter into some kind of détente or rapprochement with Xi Jinping and with China. And, India has always had this fear lurking in the background of Washington and Beijing coming together, forming some kind of G2 accommodation that would end up leaving India kind of hanging out to dry. How acute do you think these fears are today within the kind of ruling establishment?
I think there is a significant amount of fear. I mean, it's not just in terms of, I think, the specifics of a G2 or what Musk might do. The point is that, Indian system is very bureaucratized. And so bureaucracy is like predictability. And the one thing that they have great difficulty, and that is despite the fact that the current foreign minister has been extremely flexible and, very nimble. I mean, as I said earlier, very nimble, reacting to situations quite quickly and so on and so forth. And they've had to, but nevertheless, in general, they prefer predictability. So it is one thing to have, to know for sure that, if it's a G2 or whatever, then you have the Russia option, or you have the global south or whatever. I mean, but it is its uncertainty that we don't know what might happen tomorrow. With Musk, especially because both Musk and Trump are quite difficult to predict in terms of what they might do next. So I think there is a fear that because of those business interests, and clearly Musk clearly has those interests in mind in many ways, especially the last few years because of the advantages that the Chinese system has given him in terms of setting up his plant and things of that kind. I mean, but it's also the other part about it that I think that is not that the Indian system doesn't fully understand is that the Chinese EV manufacturers are also becoming quite good. I mean, they are beating Tesla at its own game. They are some of the largest automobile exporters in many other parts of the world, Chinese EVs, because they're also cheaper than, in many cases, than Tesla. So it is possible that over the next few years, Musk might not get those kinds of market benefits that he thinks he will in China. And so, that this might again change. But the point is that as of now, I think the fear is that he might be an undue influence on Trump in terms of China. That is particularly made acute by what Musk did, the last time when he didn't turn up for despite being given an audience and whatnot. And so it's a little bit, I think more than anything else, it is the uncertainty that comes with people like this, which is the problem that the Indian system has. They can't sort of know how to deal with that uncertainty. I think that is where the biggest concern comes with Musk, not just the G2, but also the whole uncertainty business. And I don't think that meeting that he had, that very odd meeting that Musk had with the prime minister, helped either.
And his children and the children's nanny,
I mean,
and
that
so
was on. Has to be one of the oddest photographs in diplomacy in recent times. But I mean, it's so. I mean, I don't think the Indian system bargained for it. I mean, I don't think they understood what was. Yeah.
Right. Well, I mean, look, to be fair, I mean, even I think the American system doesn't quite know what to make of like the world's richest man occupying a space in the seat of power, holding bilateral meetings with visiting foreign heads of state, right? I mean, it's unprecedented is getting so overused. We have to come up with other synonyms for it because,
but also that, that I don't know whether they knew they were getting into that meeting. It's very odd that they would agree to a meeting with Musk and his babies. I mean, it's one thing to have a private meeting with the prime minister, but not with the entire foreign policy establishment sitting there. I mean, it seemed as if they got caught by surprise. I don't know. Of course, we will get the story later at some point, I'm sure, but it seemed a very odd sort of photo, to say the least.
So, Rajesh, I mean, just if we kind of pivot from China to Russia for a moment, I mean, is this their kind of counterbalancing or countervailing effects? Because, we talked about the China fears, but on the other hand, when it comes to Russia, I mean, we're seeing a much more Russia-friendly policy. I mean, we've seen the president's remarks on Ukraine. We've seen what the new defense secretary have said. We've seen what his envoy, Keith Kellogg, has said at meeting with Vladimir Zelensky. Obviously, Russia has been a thorn in the side of the U.S. India relationship because many people in Washington and other Western capitals as well have been uneasy that India has not unambiguously criticized Putin's invasion and so on and so forth. And the fact that there's a not just ongoing but burgeoning energy trade and ongoing defense trade, that has been kind of a thorn in the side. But does this give India more breathing room? Because, the issue of kind of Russia being the bad guy in the room, right? I mean, that's not really the focus of U.S. policy anymore.
Yeah, for the next 4 years at least, I think India doesn't have to play defense on the Russia relationship. I think that is true. But there might be other ways in which other problems with the Russia relationship that India has vis-a-vis the U.S. One of which is, of course, the whole unpredictability part, right? I mean, until the Saudi Arabia meeting, it seemed as if the Trump administration and Trump himself was headed for something, slightly more moderate position. And then suddenly everything broke apart. I mean, after the Saudi meeting, I don't know, we don't know what happened, but basically he went back to what everybody suspected his views were, which was very, very anti-Ukraine and very, very pro-Russia, because for a period of time, even since the inauguration, for at least a week, he seemed to be taking the middle position. It wasn't really as anti-Ukraine as it has become in the last 2 days. In fact, the Ukrainians I did welcome the Trump administration. They thought that, okay, now, you have such slightly more certainty about the regime, the government in DC, and maybe that they can convince him to about Ukraine's case. There was a lot of hope in Ukraine, partly because of desperation, obviously, but nevertheless, there was some hope in Ukraine, but that is all dashed. So again, it's an unsteadiness part of it, which is a problem. When it comes to the India part, that unsteadiness also means, let's say, for example, on petroleum imports. I mean, does that come out of Russia has become one of the largest suppliers of fuel to India. Now, will Trump demand that India reduce Russian oil imports and replace that with the US oil imports? Because that's, I don't really see very many other options, because some level of Russian imports have to come down, because it's climbed from nothing to, I don't know, 30-35% of total oil imports, I think. Similarly, on fighter planes, the F-35 versus the Su-57, and so there are all of these other complications that come up, not the same complications as in the Biden administration, but other complications that could potentially come up in the U.S., Russia, India triangle, mainly because Trump wants India to import more petroleum or wants to sell the F-35 or things like that. So there are, but underneath all of that is the uncertainty of what Trump might do. I mean, the fact that he's not very steady, that, he could change his mind tomorrow, or he might make a new demand tomorrow, and that how does that sort of affect India's relations with Russia? I mean, if India were to significantly reduce Russian oil imports, what effect will that have on India-Russia relations? If India decides to replace, I mean, we don't have a deal with Russia on the Su-57, but if the F-35s have to be purchased, then there are complications with the S-400 system that we already have, and so how does that get resolved? If we throw the Russians overboard on that, then it creates again problems for Russia relationship. I mean, so it's a different set of problems, but coming out of the uncertainty of what kind of demands Trump makes, but there are all of these problems. I think so. Yes, there are definitely some reasons for concern with regard to that triangle between the Russia, U.S. and India. Not the same problems, but different kind of problems. Yeah.
Right. Rajesh, let me maybe bring this to a close by asking you one last thing, which is about, kind of a broader question about India's role in the world, right? We've heard a lot of talk since Modi's come to office about India pivoting from being a balancing power to being a leading power. That's been kind of a central motif of this prime minister's agenda. Jaishankar has talked about it as well. You end your most recent piece by saying, I thought something which was quite revealing. You said, India is a strong and growing power, but its position is somewhat more disadvantageous today than either in the 1950s or even the 1990s. And I wonder if you could just explain for us why you conclude that.
Yeah, because if you look at the structural condition that India faces, which is basically in terms of the power relationships, even while India has grown in the last 4 or 5 decades quite rapidly, not comparable to China, but nevertheless quite rapidly for a developing country, India's position related to China, which is what matters in terms of the structural condition, has weakened. So India has, because we were roughly at the comparable size in terms of economic size, in terms of wealth, in, let's say, as recently as the mid-80s. And that has been the case from the time of independence, right? I mean, from the 40s onwards till the 80s, India and China were roughly comparable. Well, China was slightly ahead, but not by a huge number. I mean, it's roughly the same size in terms of wealth. Wealth as a kind of a basis for power. But since then, obviously, China has grown by leaps and bounds. So India's position relative to China which is the most important thing because it's a neighbor, unresolved disputes, all of that our position has gradually weakened, even while in absolute terms and even in relative terms to others, we have grown India has grown in the last 4 decades. But related to China, from rough parity, we are now about 1/4 or 1/5 of China, right? I mean, and all this talk about, we will be the world's 3rd largest economy by 2030 is completely irrelevant because Japan is now the world's 3rd largest economy, and it's at something like $6 trillion, which is like a 1/3 or a 1/4 of where China is, right? So they are not. I mean, even what matters is the direct sort of the size of the economy rather than whether you are number 3 or number 4 or number 5, because that really doesn't make any difference in terms of your power relative to China. And so that is the point that I've been making, because, it is India might become a $5 trillion economy and the world's 3rd largest, whatever. But by then, China would be $25 trillion, so then how does it make any difference? I mean, your position relative to China continues to worsen, continues to, doesn't really help. And so that is a point that I was making, that India relative to the 1950s. In 1950s, we were roughly comparable. 1990s, we were roughly comparable. China was already on its, well on its way, but still. But now they are 4 or 5 times our size. And so that has a huge implication for India. And that is not going to change for the next, 15, 20 years. If everything goes our way, then maybe 15, 20 years, we reach a situation where we were in the 1990s or the 1950s.
My guest on the show this week is Rajesh Rajagopalan. He's a professor of international relations at JNU in Delhi. He's an expert on nuclear policy, Indian foreign policy, U.S. India relations. He's the author of a recent article in ThePrint on the Modi-Trump summit, but also a regular contributor to that online publication. We will link to several of his articles in the show notes. Rajesh, when I wrote to you to ask if you wanted to do this, I said that I was really struck by your candor, by your clarity, and I think you've revealed both of those qualities today. Thanks so much for taking the time.
Thank you so much, Peter. Thank you for inviting me.
Granth Tamasha is a co-production of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and the Hindustan Times. This podcast is an HT Smartcast original and is available on htsmartcast.com. You can also find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Don't forget to rate and review. It helps others find the show more easily. For more information about the show, to support the work we do on Granth Tamasha, and to find the writing we mentioned on this week's episode, visit our website, granthamasha.com. Tim Martin is our audio engineer. Mira Verghese is our executive producer. Additional assistance is provided by Annabelle Richter. Thanks for listening, and see you next week.
This was a Hindustan Times production, brought to you by HT Smartcast.
HT Smartcast.